Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Optimize Web Performance to Maximize Digital Revenue. Thanks for joining us. I'm Samantha from Digiday, and I'll be your moderator. Today's webinar is sponsored by Akamai. Akamai makes it easier for businesses around the world to deliver the best and most secure digital experiences. We're joined today by Simon Hearn, Web Performance Solutions Engineer at Akamai. Simon's role at Akamai is to support customers with a range of digital performance management solutions, including mPulse and Cloud Test. He lends his extensive experience in the web performance industry to help customers prioritize performance and implement the best solutions for managing and improving their site speed and reliability. A question and answer period will follow the presentation, so please stay with us until the end. Feel free to submit questions at any time via the GoToWebinar platform. Everyone who registered for today's webinar will also receive an email with a recording of the session tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. Okay, let's get started. Simon, take it away.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I'm really excited to talk today about two of my favorite things, site speed and money. I've been working in web performance over the last 8 years, and I've spent a lot of time focusing on digital publishing, so moving from print space into the web space, and how we can make more money, how we can improve our user experience, how we can build better products for our customers. So today I want to talk about how we manage digital revenue in 2019 and beyond. Defining site speed, I often conflate the terms performance or business performance and web performance, but I want to focus on site speed and how that correlates with business performance. We'll talk about some of the levers we have within IT, dev, and ops on speed, and how that impacts revenue, how we can maximize revenue based on our existing IT platform. And finally, I want to talk about things we can do today to improve revenue, to improve site speed, and to have happier customers. But first off, I'm going to show you quite a few charts. I'm going to show a little bit of data, and it all comes from Akamai's mPulse product. It's a real user monitoring product. It is a JavaScript snippet that sits on your website, collects data about user experiences. Think of it like Google Analytics on steroids, and it sends data back to us where we can start to use the information, the performance metrics, and correlate that back to whether someone viewed an article, whether someone subscribed, their propensity to move on to do other things on the site. So Akamai mPulse is the JavaScript snippet, the data collection mechanism that drives all the data that I'm going to be talking about today. So circulation is still, for most people, for most digital publishers, the key source of revenue. So that's ad impressions and clicks. But also there's a movement towards advertorials and sponsored content, people paying to have space on your site. And of course, there's subscription and paywalls. And I think we look at about 30% of our clients who are publishers are using a paywall or subscription as a source of revenue, and the rest are focusing on ads. What's interesting about these is they all focus on people on site. It's all around circulation. It's all about how many people are on the site, how many people do we get per day, and how long do they spend on the site. So when we talk about making more money, it's all about getting more traffic or more page views, more ad views per user who hits the site. And of course, if you have better content, more compelling content, better journalism, more people are likely to come, and then you're going to get more traffic and more sessions and longer sessions, and thus more hits. So let's get back to speed. We know that speed matters. I'm sure you've all seen case studies about performance. The BBC had a really interesting case study where they worked out that for every second their site got slower, they lost 10% of users. Obviously, that's a curve that drops off over time, but it's a real key thing for an organization that isn't trying to generate revenue in the UK, especially, that they lost traffic when they got slower. Pinterest, which is another company that doesn't directly make revenue through sales, but when they improved their load time, they saw an increase in SEO traffic and an increase in conversions to people signing up to Pinterest, to creating accounts. what I think is really interesting about Pinterest is the SEO traffic aspect. There's been a lot of discussion around the mobile first indexing with Google lately and how they penalize slow sites, especially on mobile. And performance can be a key thing to jump up one level in your SEO ranking. In the Financial Times, when they released a new ft.com homepage, one of their core focuses was on site speed, on how fast they can deliver content to their users, and their engagement rose by 30%. So that's the number of pages, number of articles viewed per user. I've been speaking about speed a little bit, and I think it's important to kind of define what we mean by speed. And it's different for everybody, but this is what I mean when I talk about speed. When I say I ask people for help. I was writing a talk, pretty much this talk, back in March this year, and I asked, what do you use as your key measure for site speed? And it was kind of split between load time and first paint. But I think what I'd really like to do is work out from you in the audience what you mean by speed. What do you measure? So I'm going to ask the moderator to start a poll shortly. And I want to know whether you measure the page load timing event, so window on load, any kind of DOM measurement, or whether you use paint timing, so first contentful paint, first meaningful paint, first paint, whether you have a custom timer. So the BBC or BBC News a couple of years ago decided that time to first headline and time to first scroll were their most important timers to measure. Or whether you don't personally measure performance, or you don't know what your business measures. So we can run that poll now. It'll run for about 30 seconds or so, just to make sure that we get as many answers as possible. And I think it'd be really interesting to find out what it is you're measuring at the moment. Page load has been around since IE6, and it gives us a really good indicator of a general proxy for user experience. It tells us when JavaScript, asynchronous JavaScript, is allowed to execute, which should mean that the whole page is loaded. Unfortunately, single page apps make this a bit complex because the page load event can be almost instantaneous. But in general, we can use it as a pretty valid proxy for user experience. Paint timing is great because it gives us a better idea of what's happening on the screen, but it's only available in evergreen browsers. And custom timers require maintenance, require understanding how your page loads and how important different timing events are to your user experience.
Okay, so it looks like about 83% of attendees have voted. So we're going to close the poll and share the results now.
Okay, brilliant. So the majority are measuring page load, and I'm happy to see so many people using paint timing, but no one's using a custom timing metric. No one's using a custom timer. That's unsurprising because of the maintenance overhead, but I think that's going to really help for context with the rest of the presentation. So thank you very much. Let's see if I can move forward. So we talk about timing metrics generally in a DevOps mindset, but when we're thinking about how a user experiences a site, it's not when the page load event happens. What actually matters to a user can be broken down into 3 stages. So the first one is it working? Am I on the right site? Did I click the correct link? And am I not going to waste the next 30 seconds of my life waiting for this page to load? The second stage is it useful? Is it the thing I wanted to see? Can I see text? Can I see the images and not just placeholders on the page? And thirdly, is it interactive? And there's a few terms for this. I think interactive is probably the best. Fluid and responsive are also used to mean the same thing. So if I try to scroll the page, does it scroll smoothly? If I try to click on a link or a button, does it respond quickly, or am I sitting there tapping the same thing over and over again? So to talk about these three phases, if we look at working, I slowed down my user experience when I did this, using Chrome DevTools to increase my CPU throttling. But if I am searching in Google and I'm on the search engine results page looking for real user monitoring, which is Akamai Impulse, when I click on the link, there's a phase where nothing happens. So when the browser is making its first request, downloading the HTML, and the browser is waiting to have enough content to paint something to the screen. That first paint is normally white, which has got a bad reputation, first paint, because it can be a white screen. But what's important is that's when your browser can first switch context. So from a search engine results page to your landing page, that's the first paint timer. So two key timings around is it working for a user are time to first byte, how quickly you can get content to the browser, to the client, and first paint, how much content has to be delivered to the user before the browser says, I'm able to paint something to the screen. And that can be more complex than we might think. Okay, moving on to, is it useful? This can be really tricky to measure. If we look at clicking on that link again, first paint now, and we have something on the screen. For me, is it useful is, can I read text? Is the font rendered? And can I consume the content? Especially for publishing, there's two types of things you want to present to a user. Ads and the content that they actually wanted to see. And if you can present the content they wanted to see quickly, they're more likely to hang around. That's a blanket statement, but I'll justify that shortly. So measuring whether a page is useful or not, like I said, is quite complex. The DOM, the document object model, is the browser's internal representation of a page. And there's a few timings they give us from a browser perspective. DOM complete and DOM content loaded, which tell us when the browser's got enough data to paint something on the screen. Recently, Google Chrome has driven paint timing through the paint timing API, which gives us first paint and first contentful paint. First contentful paint is something I'll leave you as homework to look up. It's quite interesting to try to create a generic timer that gives meaningful data around a user experience. And time to visually ready, which is an impulse specific timer, which can be based on when something critical like your article hero image is loaded. So when the browser has given something to the user that they actually came to see. And I borrowed this video for Is It Interactive from a tweet a few months ago, which kind of highlights an issue that I'm sure you've experienced before, trying to interact with a page that doesn't respond. So something really frustrating is you load a page and it renders quickly on your phone or your tablet or your desktop. You try to interact with it and nothing happens. In research we published last year, we reckon there's about a 30% budget between rendering content and being able, and it having to be interactive. Otherwise, you get frustrated users. So we've got a few ways to measure this. A lot of them are limited to evergreen browsers. Time to interactive, first input delay, and time to first interaction are relatively available metrics as to how interactive a page is. Rage clicks is something that Impulse and a few user experience monitoring tools provide. And it basically measures how often someone tries to click on something multiple times. You hit a link, nothing happens, you hit it again, still nothing happens, you're not having a great user experience. Rage is a strong word, but I think it reflects some of our experiences when a page doesn't do what you expect it to do, especially if it's a transport app. Something about transport apps not responding creates lots of frustration. So in summary, TTFB, time to first byte, is how fast you can get content to a user, and that's from your domain, your hosts, your CDN, your origin. DOM content loaded is how quickly you can deliver the stuff that is critical for the browser to render anything. So that's HTML and blocking JavaScript. First paint is the first time something is rendered. And in 9 times out of 10, that's a blank screen. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad timing point. First contentful paint is when the user might see something. So it should be text. And time to visually ready is when key content is rendered. So it depends on your implementation, but it should be when a page is effectively available to a user. Now, page load time has got a bit of a bad reputation lately because it doesn't work well with single page applications, but it's still a great proxy for user experience, especially in my situation where I'm comparing multiple websites, multiple different delivery stacks, multiple frameworks. It's a good proxy for how fast or slow a site is. Now, time to interactive is an interesting one because you kind of work back from the last time the CPU was really busy. So your browser was too busy processing JavaScript to actually give you a response. And when the network was also quiet. So for the TTI timer to fire, the network has to be quiet. Your browser's not downloading multiple assets at the same time. And also JavaScript execution has to be free for a number of milliseconds. So the page should be interactive at that time. First input delay is an interesting one. It's tough to use this in without context. So the idea is that you tap on your screen or you click on your mouse. How long does it take for the browser to process the function, the click, the event when you interact with a page? And this one can be really tricky. A really interesting use case recently was an e-commerce site, a large European e-commerce site that saw their first input delay jump from about 40 milliseconds to 300 milliseconds in aggregate across all of their users. And it turned out that they had slipped in some large images that weren't visible, which meant the browser had to spend longer to decode those images, and it made the user experience slower. This is a really great resource. I visit it at least once a day. It's not just about Akamai's Impulse beacons. It's about resource timing and navigation timing and all the different data that you can collect from a browser, the what's in a beacon docs. Okay, so I've focused quite a little bit on the technical details of speed. What I want to think about now is performance levers. How can we influence our user experiences and the business performance? But what I want to focus on first is engagement. So when I talk about business performance, especially for a non-e-commerce site, there tend to be a couple of key metrics that we're trying to improve. It's page views, hits, sessions, then bounce rate, session length, and retention rate. A retention rate is probably an overused term. In this case, I mean, if someone visits a site, what is the likelihood, or visits a page, sorry, what is the likelihood that they're going to visit another page on the same site after hitting that page? So now it's time for our second poll. How do you measure engagement? Bounce rate or exit rate is how often people visit your site and leave again. Session length is how long someone spends on your site in terms of page views, articles read. Subscriptions and registrations, which isn't really engagement, more conversion, but is obviously a critical business measure. And then, I don't know, it's not my responsibility, we don't really measure engagement. So I'll ask the moderator to open up the poll. I did tweet this out a couple of months ago as a question, and session length was the winner, just. Session length and session duration are different. It's really difficult to track not only a user experience across multiple pages on a site, something that Google Analytics is good at, but also how long someone spends on the site in an active phase. So they could be on the site for 16 hours. It's unlikely they were consuming content that whole time.
Okay, so it looks like about 77% of attendees have voted. Oh, it's rising a bit. So we're going to close the poll in just a few more seconds.
Excellent. I'm expecting subscriptions to be quite high and session length to be quite high. Okay, so 2/3 of the audience measure engagement with session length. I'm sure that there are answers which aren't in this 3-question poll effectively, but session length is a really good measure of engagement that I've seen that's quite transferable across different businesses. If you make something worse, people are less likely to visit multiple pages, less likely to spend time on the site. Okay, so bounce rate and session length are key. Excellent, thank you. Speaking of bounce rate and session length, here I've got some data from 5 publishers. There's quite a lot going on, so I'll talk you through it. We're looking at retention and bounce rate. So retention rate is, like I said just now, the likelihood that someone will visit another page given that they've visited this page. And on the x-axis, we've got the speed of the interaction. So at the moment we're looking at time to interactive, we're looking at mobile devices, and we're looking at the homepage of these publishers. If we look at the first publisher, which is a subscription-driven business, you can see that the retention rate, so the likelihood of someone visiting another page after they visit the homepage, is pretty constant. So that's these circle dots across the top. The bounce rate, however, shows a distinct increase as the site gets slower. So again, on the x-axis, we've got the speed of time to interactive. The peak is around 4,000, their median is around 6,000. And if you look at a single metric like bounce rate, you'll get a number. In this case, it'll be about 40%. So 40% of visitors who hit the homepage will not visit another page. But if you filtered that down just to users who had a really fast experience, around 2,000 milliseconds, for example, 2 seconds, that number would be 20%. So you can halve your bounce rate just by getting an experience from 4 or 5 seconds down to 2 seconds in the case of this website. And what's interesting is when we switch from the home page to the article page, and now the charts look slightly different. An article page tends to be slower for users on this publisher site, around 6 seconds as the peak, and around 7.5 seconds as the median. And we see that the bounce rate starts off around 40%, 30% for users around a 3-second experience, and quickly explodes up to 60, 70, 80% when you get your median load time. So the median experience gives you a 70 or 80% bounce rate, but the really fast experiences keep people on the site. And I said it at the beginning, fast experiences keep people on the site. I'm sure there's this mental model that I've allocated a certain amount of time to visit this website to achieve this task. And if the site takes longer to render content to me, I have less time to visit other pages. I'm less likely to spend more time on that site. Okay, if we go back to homepage and look at another publisher. So number 1 is subscription-based. Number 2 is advert-based. And what's interesting is the relationship between speed and engagement is much stronger with an advert-based publisher. And this kind of makes sense because if you've paid for a subscription, you're more likely to stick around on a site, even if it's a little bit slower, because you're committed. But if your revenue model drives from unauthenticated users, from adverts, from retargeting, then performance seems to be more important. So your retention rate, the likelihood of someone going to another page after visiting the home page, in this case, drops from 80% at a really fast experience all the way down to about 35% at a median experience. This site has quite a broad distribution, so it's not a terribly consistent user experience. Again, this is on mobile. If we switch to different device types, we don't see much difference in the behavior or the relationship between speed and engagement. What we do see is that their desktop site is a little bit faster than their mobile site, which is what we see with most of our customers. There's one oddity in this, which is a video-based publisher. Every article pretty much has 1 or 2 videos. So their user experience is quite hard to measure, because is it when a video first appears? Is it when the play button is first available? Or is it when the first segment of video is ready to be played? And this is something we can start to measure more accurately with mPulse. But using time to interactive, which is a measure which is universal across these 5 clients, it's more of a bland result. Bounce rate increases, as you might expect, when you get really slow experiences. And then we switch to articles, which shows they have a really consistent user experience, around 2 seconds, 3 seconds. But once they get slower than a second, their bounce rate drops off a cliff. And this is common across all of our clients: publishing, e-commerce, banking, finance. If we move on to session length, I like this chart because all of these 5 sites have different performance profiles, these distributions. The green one has a nice peak around 2 seconds. The red and the orange have really broad distributions, so they're generally slower and less consistent. This is on mobile and homepage again. But what's interesting is the session length here we're looking at, with a peak of 12 pages per session on average, drops at the same point across all of these clients. So user experience or users' expectations aren't set by the site, by the publisher, they're set by their internal goals, their internal timelines, which unfortunately are often set by native apps. If we're looking at mobile again, if you've just switched from using Facebook or Instagram to a mobile web page, there is inherently a delay. It's going to take longer to render content. And what's clear from here is that expectations are consistent no matter what speed your site is. So you should always be faster than you think you should be, which is quite interesting. Some goal speeds. We looked at about 1 billion beacons, and the inflection point in the curves for engagement, for user experience, for bounce rate, all kind of settled around these numbers. So half a second time to first byte seems like a lot, especially if you measure synthetically, but across the world, 500 milliseconds is actually quite a good thing to aim for. And that's the point where people start to leave your site from the data we've collected. And with time to interactive, 4 seconds seems to be the sweet spot. That's where people's expectations are set. Okay, so I've talked a lot about technical stuff, about metrics, about timings, looked at some data across 5 different publishers, which shows that speed is critical to engagement metrics. The poll showed that session length was a good proxy for engagement, and we've shown that performance has a direct correlation with session length. So how can we improve it? How can we make our users more engaged and make more revenue, more money? Like I said, 2 of my favorite things, site speed and money. So first thing is to manage third parties, sorry. I've put a little icon of school children. Sometimes I feel like third parties are a little bit like school children. You have to keep telling them what to do, because if you let them run to their own game, they will do things that are not positive for site speed and revenue. The size of JavaScript on your page correlates with time to interactive. And this is kind of obvious when you think about it. The more JavaScript a browser has to parse and download, the longer it'll take before the page is ready to be used. This chart is taken across multiple hundreds of customers across a decent time range. And in terms of size of JavaScript over the network, below 2 megabytes, sorry, it's kind of the threshold where things get really bad. And unfortunately, the majority of JavaScript in most cases comes from domains outside of your control. So the pretty firework picture behind this text is generated from requestmap.webperf.tools, and it looks at every request on a page and classifies it as a third party or first party, whether it's analytics or advertising, and shows you the weight of that asset as the size of the blob. And in a lot of cases, third parties are responsible for over 90% of the weight of a page in terms of bytes of the network, and generally over 70% of requests on the page. We need third parties to generate revenue. They do advertising, analytics, optimization. Akamai Impulse is a third-party script. What seems to be challenging is ownership of that. There's a great post on Medium by The Telegraph, Gareth Clubb at The Telegraph, talking about how they've improved web performance. And a lot of the impact came from reducing the amount of third-party content on the page. We had a collection of very old scripts and couldn't track the original requester. We removed those on the premise that if they were important, people would get back in touch, and no one did. And this is a story I've heard a couple of times. It's risky to just delete stuff off the site, but hopefully you're in a position where you can remove tags and put them back on quickly if you have to. A lot of time third parties hang around after a contract has expired or a project is finished, and there's no mechanism to determine what should be removed from the page. And having a third-party tracker, a third-party policy, can really help manage that over time. You can manage that with a heavy hand using content security policy. It's a header or a meta tag in your HTML, which says what scripts are allowed to run on your site, and it will beacon data back to a nominated URL. And that's really interesting. It's tricky because you can break your site if you get it wrong, but it's a heavy-handed approach to manage third-party content in the client, and something that I expect more people will be taking up in the next few months. So the best way to manage third parties is remove the ones that aren't being used, defer the non-critical scripts, and use a content security policy. I've put defer non-critical scripts here, and I'll go into a bit more detail in a second about deferring. Okay, we were looking at some key metrics like first paint, time to first byte, and DOM content loaded. This is the critical content that a browser needs to be able to start rendering a page. Secondary to that are the fonts to be able to render text. Now, for the majority of publishers, people are visiting a page to see text, so that becomes your critical content. Unsurprisingly, there's a really strong correlation between time to first byte and time to interactive. This little spike here is error pages, either served by the origin really quickly or served by the edge also very quickly. So 404s tend to respond very fast, but you get this direct linear correlation between time to first byte and time to interactive. So every time your time to first byte gets 10 milliseconds slower, you can assume that your time to interactive also gets 10 milliseconds slower. So focusing on TTFB, if you're not around the 100 millisecond mark, could be a good way to make some quick wins. And you can improve that at the edge. There's a great article here by Tim Varecki at Akamai about using prefresh, which is an Akamai feature where you can say, serve my HTML content within, or cache it for, say, 2 hours in this case. But every 10% of that, check that it's still the same. So cache prefreshing means you can cache content at the edge for a longer duration than you would normally be comfortable with, but fetching it from origin more frequently to ensure that fresh content is being delivered to the user. And I'd highly recommend reading that if you use edge caching for HTML, and even more so if you don't, because this overcomes a lot of the concerns around caching HTML for publishers. Now, I said rendering text is important because people come to read content. The time at which the last font loads on a page directly correlates with time to interactive. Some of this is kind of obvious because if you have a slow experience, everything gets slower. But if you can't read content, if you see a blank screen of text, that can be extremely frustrating and you could lose a user for a week or more. So there are ways to hack this, to get fonts to render earlier. I don't think I've seen a website recently that doesn't use custom web fonts, but I have seen sites that give you blank text. So preloading your fonts, got an e-commerce site on the left with preload on the right. You see the new product text and the product details render much quicker when you have a preload hint, telling the browser that it's going to need these web fonts. Because by default, the browser won't even make a request for the fonts until it has built the DOM, until it knows that it needs to download that font. Unfortunately, that can create a lot of overhead on the network, downloading a lot of fonts that you might not necessarily need because you're kind of hacking the way the browser works. So there is another way around getting your text to render quickly, and that's using the font display property in your CSS. So you have a number of options. By default, it's none, so you'll show no text, like block. You'll show no text for the first 3 seconds. Then it will fall back to a system font. And then when the font downloads, it'll flip in the web font and show you the text in the web font that your brand guidelines have decided is good. There are 3 other options. Google Fonts has just enabled swap as a default, and that'll show the system font as soon as possible. So it'll render text as soon as the browser has it, and then we'll swap in the web font when the web font is available. Fallback and optional are kind of design decisions, whether you want to show a web font, whether you want to show system fonts even when your web font isn't available, to give a more consistent user experience. So these are great ways to control the experience with fonts. And there's a great article by Adi Osmani about this. So serve HTML as quick as you can and show text as soon as you can. My biggest challenge with this tends to be around people who own brand, marketing, and PR. They want to focus on delivering the brand image rather than content. And if you can do a swap, so in most cases, you show the branded font first, but when the site speed is really slow, you still show content, then that's where font display can be really valuable. Okay, images. This graph has come out really light, but in general, the more images there are on a page, the slower the user experience. This will become more prevalent on mobile devices, especially low-end Android devices where there's limited RAM and CPU to rasterize and process and render all of these images. And even if they're not rendered on the display, they still have to be rasterized when they're downloaded. So not only do lots of images take up time on the network, they take up time on the CPU. So this is something you shouldn't have to worry about yourself. There are lots of digital asset management solutions and image management solutions available. Akamai Image Manager is my favorite for obvious reasons, but it allows you to optimize images automatically based on the browser that's trying to render them. So you can deliver WebP to Chrome, JPEG 2000 and JPEG XR to the browsers that support them. Another Adi Osmani article looked at lazy loading images. This timeline is half a second, starting at 2.5 seconds, and with 10 meg of images, you get nothing until 3 seconds and the page carries on loading forever on a mobile device. If you lazy load images, you get to prioritize the images that are visible on the network. So some of this is coming for free with HTTP 2, which on Chrome only downloads 1 image at a time. But if you tell the browser not to worry about other images, the ones below the fold, it gives the browser more time to focus on the ones that are important. You can also use low quality image placeholders, something that Image Manager supports. But soon, as this link highlights, there will be native image lazy loading through a loading attribute on image tags. So you can tell the browser which images are important, which aren't. So I think the most important thing is to defer images which aren't visible. Okay, DOM complexity. This is how much work a browser is put through to render a page. I put a brain there because it's a complex exercise to build a website from HTML. And if we can make that easier for browsers, they can render things faster. So there's a reasonable correlation between how complex a page is in terms of how many DOM nodes, so that's div tags, p tags, images, and how fast the user experience is. This goes from 0 milliseconds on the bottom all the way up to 10 seconds. So the lower the complexity of your page, the less the browser has to do to render it, and the faster the user experience can be. So the ways to improve that are to render on the server. So if you're using a single page application framework, to use server-side rendering, avoiding infinite scroll. And for a while, infinite scroll was the cool thing to do to improve user experience because you never navigate away from a page. The problem is that as you build up more content in the page, everything starts to slow down. And to adopt a common CSS methodology, which is easy to say and really hard to do, but having a good naming strategy and a good CSS strategy can be critical in reducing DOM complexity. And deferring and reducing JavaScript execution. So this is a hard one to measure in aggregate. We know that a lot of JavaScript on a page reduces performance. We know that just parsing the JavaScript is pretty bad. Thankfully, JavaScript engines like V8 are getting better at not parsing and compiling code that isn't used on a page. But still, if you download 100K of JavaScript, that's going to take a decent amount of time in hundreds of milliseconds on most Android mobile phones. So we need to let the browser focus on what's important. Going back to that article by Gareth Clark at The Telegraph, the single biggest improvement and the easiest to implement technically came from deferring all JavaScript, including our own. And it's as simple as adding a defer attribute. The nice thing about defer is it preserves order of execution. So the scripts will be downloaded when the browser is ready to download them and executed when there is idle time on the CPU. So you're giving the user a chance to interact with the page before non-critical JavaScript has to execute on the page. What you may lose by doing that is some of the analytics data. JavaScript that executes so late that the user has already navigated away. But in terms of improving user experience, this screenshot from the article shows an improvement from 5 seconds to 1.5 seconds of actually rendering an article page or a page with images, which is pretty impressive for 6 characters in an attribute. So ideally, we'd only ship the JavaScript that's necessary for a page. Of course, what's necessary differs by what department you're in. And we should be able to differentiate between a low-end Android device, which really struggles with JavaScript, and a high-end MacBook Pro, or a Mac Pro, if you've got $1,000 to spend on a monitor mount. Because executing JavaScript on a low-end Android device is hundreds of times more costly than doing it on a desktop device. So we should be able to send better content, kind of what like Google AMP is trying to do, which I won't comment on further. But the idea is that you should be able to send content to a user and then gradually improve the user experience through JavaScript if possible. And maybe defer everything. Why not try it? So in conclusion, if you're not actively measuring site speed, you really should be. A decent number of people in the first poll said they weren't measuring speed. And a significant number of people said they're still measuring page load, which I'm not particularly against, but it may highlight a lack of maturity in the site speed measurement space. Correlate speed with behavior. And this is, it's again, easy to say and hard to do. If you're measuring speed in one tool and user engagement and conversions and subscriptions in another tool, there's no kind of direct link between the two. Something that mPulse does really well is it allows you to plug in whatever you care about as a business, as well as all your site speed data. Like I said, Google Analytics on steroids, to be able to start building the correlation, to build the business case, to justify time spent on site speed. And find your sweet spots. So in all of the graphs I showed earlier, there were inflection points, sweet spots where if you achieve that speed, users are less likely to bounce than they are to bounce, which is a good place to be. So if you know what those timing points are, those sweet spots, you can set goals. And they're goals based on business intelligence, goals based on user engagement, and not just technical numbers. And that's where we see our best results from our customers, is when they start to build this relationship between speed and user experience and engagement. So that's all I've got for you. I'm hoping there'll be some questions. I hope that was relatively informative. And if you do want to view this presentation, it's on simonherne.com/presentations/digital-revenue. And I'll be posting a blog post about this with more detail in the coming weeks. So if you follow me on Twitter at simonherne, you'll see when that comes out. Otherwise, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Simon, for all of your great insights. And this is just a reminder for all of our attendees. The full recording of the webinar will be made available to you in a follow-up email tomorrow. So we're going to move on now to the question and answer portion of the webinar. So we have a couple of questions here. Excuse me. The first one asks, is there an observer effect with mPulse? Does measuring speed make the site slower?
Yeah, good question. So like I said, mPulse is another JavaScript snippet. It does have to execute in the browser. So there is a non-negligible amount of time it consumes. We have an engineering team dedicated to managing the performance impact. And we constantly do AA and AB tests. And at the moment, we're looking about 3 milliseconds in aggregate is the impact on page load time for having mPulse. And we've just released a new loader snippet, a new way of executing mPulse on the page, which makes that negligible, so almost zero. But yes, it's a good question. You can't measure something for free.
So another one asks, when talking about what matters to users, 30% between render and being interactive?
Yes. Yes, we released a bit of research last year which showed that if your time to interactive was 30% slower than your first paint, the first time someone can see something on the page, that's the inflection point in your rage clicks. That's when users started to experience more frustration. Rage clicks is a measure in mPulse, like I said earlier, which is when people try to click on a link or an icon or a button and nothing happens. So we can measure that at 30% slow or 30% after page load time. That's when users start interacting with the page. So that's a good goal to have.
So we've got very little developer time for performance. What's the quickest way to make our site faster?
The quickest way to get your site faster is to get more time with developers and to justify it as a business goal. IT tends to be seen as a cost center, not a profit center, especially in publishing. But the quickest way to make your site faster in perceived metrics, in my experience, is to deliver your fonts quicker. So to use font display fallback or to preload your critical fonts with the header. Second to that is get rid of all third parties on your site, but that's never going to happen.
So someone says, Google has a page speed index using Lighthouse. Is this a good metric to use, or is it too general?
Both of those are true. So it's a good metric to use, and it is very general. So it's possible to have 100 Lighthouse score of 100 and have a really poor performing, inaccessible page. It's a struggle we have at Akamai, is trying to create these generic measures across multiple customers. The best thing to do is work out what's important for your users. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, BBC News worked out that time to first headline and time to first scroll were their most important timing metrics. And there'll be something similar for every site out there. So it's best to work out what's important for your users, what correlates with their user engagement, and start to track those.
So someone asks if you could kindly explain the difference between session duration and session length again.
Oh yes, of course. So session duration is how long someone spends during a session. That's normally measured in minutes. And session length is how many pages or articles they view within that session. And that's measured in number of pages, so an integer. Session
And so,
length would be more valuable than session duration as a metric.
great. And someone also is curious about special considerations if running on a platform like WordPress.
Oh, lots of special considerations. It's tough to take any comment from that without context. So I'm going to leave that for a question afterwards, and that person is free to ask me on Twitter or send me an email.
So someone asks, your recommendations all require a lot of developer effort. How do I convince the team that this is important?
That's a fair question. I think adding defer to all of your JavaScript isn't a lot of developer effort. It's a lot of QA effort. But yes, it's hard to justify time on performance when there is a backlog of 500 features. I think the key thing there is to correlate performance with user engagement and experience. And a lot of the times when you see case studies, there's a website, wpostats.com, web performance optimization stats.com. And if you read any of those studies, it tends to start with a change that made performance better and the business noticed, in that it made the site speed better and business performance tracked that. So the best thing I've ever seen to help build a performance culture is to have dashboards everywhere, which show performance in terms of site speed and performance in terms of business performance in the same space. So they're contextually close to each other. That seems to be the winning pattern.
All right, so we're almost at all the time we have today, but before we wrap up, do you have any other insights that you'd like to share, Simon?
Oh, no, just that, yeah, dashboarding and sharing and publicizing performance is a great start. Even if you're not improving it, if you can track it over time, then you know what's changing. And yeah, like I said, building a performance culture starts with measuring and presenting that data publicly. And publicly within your business, you don't have to put it on a .com site. Yeah, that seems to be the winning formula.
Great. So that's all the time we have for today. And thank you again to Simon and, of course, to our partner, Akamai. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. We hope you learned something. So keep an eye on your inboxes tomorrow for a link to the recording, which you can then watch on demand. Thank you again, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.